Part 3. It took Susie less than 2 seconds to realize she had to step in. She'd overslept that morning and had hurried to meet Jake, not wanting to be late. As it was, she arrived at the same time as Jake tried to escape. Her first reaction was to stay hidden. But when she saw what happened, she was motivated to help her new friend. Bursting out of the trees and stepping easily over the knee-high fence, she was on them in less than a second. Her massive footsteps shook the ground. Billy and the others barely had time to look behind them. She slipped her right foot out of her sandal and lowered it onto him. Frank and Arthur were unable to run out of the way, but they stumbled and fell over. They were only able to look on in terror as she lowered her foot onto Billy and held him against the ground. Meanwhile, Linda had also managed to run a few feet away, but when she saw what was happening, she stopped and screamed. Her legs gave away and she fell over her knees. Billy didn't have time to see what was scaring her when a massive object pressed him against the ground. He tried to escape, but the pressure on his body was too great. He slammed his fists against the object, but to no avail, and then tried stabbing it with his knife. Still nothing happened, and the object came down on him until he was squashed so tightly that he couldn't move. Susie looked down on them and wondered what to do next. It would be the easiest thing for her to plant her foot on the ground and crush Billy out of existence. But she didn't want to kill him, not at all. It took great effort for her to balance in such a way that her foot only rested lightly on him. She could feel his puny body, but was unaware that he'd been stabbing her with his knife, since her skin was thicker than its blade. The other three were still laying around, seemingly paralyzed with fear. She had no idea where Jake was, until she felt a slight tickling on her left foot. Jake had clambered onto her foot, and was now firmly attached to her lower leg. He held on as if he was afraid he might fall off. Susie smiled, and raised her foot a few feet and gently tipped him off. "Hey, you!" she shouted at Arthur, who was attempting to flee. "You'd better stay right where you are, unless you want to see your buddy here get squished. Jake, round them up." What? A bewildered Jake called up, still cowering next to her foot. "You heard me." She lifted her foot and Billy appeared, gasping and coughing. When he saw what was above him, he screamed and began to crawl away. Susie bent down and picked him up. He flailed about, screaming and cursing. Then, without another thought, she stuffed him into her shirt's pocket. She knew he couldn't escape, not from 50 feet above ground level. Meanwhile, Jake had brought the others to her. Swiftly, she picked them up as well, stuffing Arthur in with Billy and the other two in her other pocket. Linda appeared to have fainted, while Frank looked like he was having a panic attack. When they were safely stowed away, she reached down and lifted Jake. Then she gave him a hug. "I bet you're glad to see me," she said. "Uh-huh," he grunted, pressing tightly against her body. After what he had seen, he was a little scared of her and her immense strength. But she knew how to handle people without hurting them. Letting him sit down in her open hand, she stepped back over the fence and began to head home. "Susie, you're not taking them with you, are you?" Jake asked. I mean, I'm really glad you saved me, but isn't this a bit risky?" "Maybe," she smiled impishly. "But so is letting them go. Besides, they need a lesson or two, don't you think?" He looked up at her meekly. This wasn't what either of them had wanted, but things rarely happen exactly as planned. Susie held Jake's body between her thumb and index finger and began rubbing him. He was so small compared to her, so tiny and petite, and yet she felt incredibly enamored by him. "Don't worry, Jake," she said soothingly. "I'll let them go soon enough. Then you and I can enjoy a lovely day together." When she got home, she first put Jake on the dining table. Then she took out her 4 captives and dropped them all in the kitchen sink. It was too deep for them to escape, and they looked up helplessly as she towered over them. As she pondered what to do with them, Billy spoke up. What the fuck is this? He yelled. He tried to jump up and grab the edge of the sink, but wasn't able to reach it. Susie grinned and leaned in a bit closer. Billy backed away and tried to hide behind Frank. They all stared up at her in complete fear. She took a deep breath and blew forcefully upon them. They couldn't stand up to the power of her breath and fell over, with Frank falling on top of Billy. Susie laughed. It felt amazing to be able to use her power so freely. She gleefully grabbed Frank by the leg and dangled him upside down above her head. He was screaming and begging her to let him go. Not yet, she said with a smile. She began to lower him into her open mouth, and at this point, he really began to panic. He screamed as if he were being tortured as she closed her mouth, his upper body completely inside it. She gave him a few shoves with her tongue, his arms desperately hitting everything around him. At last, she'd had enough, and she spat him out into the sink. He fell on top of Arthur, covering them both in her saliva. Ugh. You just taste awful, she said. You definitely need to bathe more often. Now, who's next? Ah, perfect. Arthur was still busy trying to dry himself off when he too was grabbed by the legs. He closed his eyes and looked ready to cry. Susie studied him a little bit before deciding the best place to put him would be beneath her foot. She took off her sandal and held him against the sole of her foot, rubbing him back and forth, giggling at his ineffectual struggles. All the while Jake watched her, partly in curiosity and in fear. He vowed never to make her angry. He didn't want to know what she would do to him if he did. Meanwhile, Linda had recovered from her daze. When she saw she was in a giant kitchen, she began to scream again. Billy turned on her angrily. Will you shut up? He screamed at her. Billy, I'm scared, she wailed. I don't want to die. Please, baby, do something. But Billy had more than he could take. He struck towards her and slapped her in the face. She fell to the floor and began to sob. I said, shut up, you bitch, he yelled and kicked her. It's your fucking fault we're here. He lifted his foot to kick her again, but suddenly found himself 50 feet in the air. Susie had heard Linda's screams, and putting Arthur down into the sink, watched horrified as Billy hit his girlfriend. At that moment, she could no longer control her anger. She grabbed Billy around the waist and began to squeeze him in her fist. At first lightly, but slowly increasing her force. She could feel his fragile little body give way under pressure, and heard his screams of intense pain. But she didn't stop. She was no longer worried what might happen to him. Her fists grew tighter and tighter. But then she heard a little voice behind her yell, Susie, stop! Slowly, as if emerging from a dream, she loosened her grip on Billy and dropped his unconscious body into the sink, turning around. There, perched on the edge of her table, was Jake. His eyes were wide with fear, and as she approached, he shrank away from her. Jake, she whimpered, but he just backed away further. Jake, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I just got so angry. She sat down and began to cry. How could she have been so unfeeling? Now her only friend thought she was a monster. Now he and everyone else would hate her. She buried her face in her hands and wished she didn't exist. She didn't see Jake cautiously approaching her, but she heard him call her name. When she didn't answer, he tried to talk to her. Susie, he said, I know you can hear me. So please listen. I'm not angry, Susie. The other day, when you told me all about you, I knew that's who you really are. A kind and wonderful person who would never just hurt someone for no reason. We all get angry sometimes. I mean, even I sometimes wish I could hurt the people who are hurting me. People like Billy. We all make mistakes. We're human. You told me that you always wished you were normal. Well, what you're feeling right now, what you felt then, that is normal. I'm still your friend, Susie, and friends forgive each other, no matter how big a mistake you make. She looked at him, and right then, he knew he was in love with her. He wanted to tell her, but couldn't. How would she react? Then he decided that the important thing to do right now was to comfort her and make her feel better. He reached out his hand, and she held out a 5-foot finger, and he hugged it. I forgive you, Susie, he said. But I'm not the one you should apologize to. He nodded in the direction of the sink. Tell them you're sorry and take them back. I think they've learned their lesson. She sniffed back her tears and nodded. With a weak okay, she got up and headed to the sink. A moment later, she came back and held out her hand for Jake to climb in. He did, and saw that she was carrying someone else in her hand. It was Linda, curled up in a ball, sobbing. I don't feel like leaving her alone with them, Susie explained. I'll take them back, but would you, watch over her while I'm gone? Please? I'll be back as soon as I can. I promise. Yeah, sure, of course, Jake said, not entirely comfortable with the plan. He and Linda were placed on Susie's bed, and she made sure that they were comfortable before leaving to take the other 3 back. Billy was in bad shape, and she wondered if he'd make it back okay. She picked up Arthur and Frank, apologized as best as she could, and put them in the pockets of her shirt. Then she picked up Billy, cradling him in her hands like a precious object, left the cabin. Jake watched her go and waited for her return. When she came back, she sat down on the bed beside him. Feeling himself suddenly attracted to her, he approached her leg cautiously. She did nothing to stop him, so he grabbed onto her skirt and tried to climb up the side of her leg. With a little help from her hand, he managed it, and fell down comfortably into her lap. She looked down and smiled on him. Thank you for understanding, Jake, she said. I know it must be difficult for you to talk to me, to be with me. It is a little, he said, lying on his back and gazing up at her. She was stroking his chest, and he felt himself becoming aroused. Quickly he turned over, hoping she didn't notice his embarrassment. She thought he didn't like it, so she picked him up and placed him back on the bed. So, how's she doing? She asked. Oh, you mean Linda? Jake looked over at the tiny, at least relatively tiny girl. Still no change. I tried talking to her, but she didn't answer. I think you scared her pretty badly. Susie picked up Linda's limp body and held her close to her face. Jake watched in amazement. It was one thing to be picked up by a colossal giantess, but to see how small someone was next to Susie really highlighted how big she was. She held Linda up close, whispering how sorry she was. but got no response other than silence. Susie turned helplessly to Jake, who was even less sure what to do. "Jake," she said, "I'm going to take her back. I can't stand watching her upset like this, and knowing it's all my fault. She'll probably never forgive me like you did." She looked like she was about to cry again, but managed to keep her emotions in check. Do you think she'll be okay?" Jake asked. "I don't know. I really hope so, but if it's not too much to ask, could you take her back to town? I don't want to leave her to go back alone. I mean, those other guys had each other, but she's..." "Sure, I'll go," Jake said. And then he added, "You've been really good to me, Susie, and I don't blame you for anything. If anything happens, if word of you gets out or anything, well, I'll be there for you. You have my word." She scooped him up and planted a big, wet kiss on his face. Then she hugged him again, more gently this time. He let himself be enveloped by her warm, loving arms, and felt certain that, no matter how bad things might get, they'd still have each other's full support and friendship. Later, after Susie had given them some refreshments, she took them back to the usual meeting spot by the fence. Linda had recovered enough to accept some food and water, but she still didn't speak to them or look them in the eyes. Susie had tried her best to make amends, but in the end she decided the best thing would be to let her leave, and hope that Jake would somehow sort things out. She couldn't understand why Billy had hit her like that, or why he was constantly picking on Jake, or why he was pretty much nasty to everyone. She put Jake and Linda on the ground and waved them goodbye. "I had planned a picnic for you today," she said sadly. "I was going to take you to this beautiful place in the forest." "And you still will," Jake answered. "Maybe not now or soon, but I'm certain you still will. Goodbye, Susie. And don't worry. Everything will turn out perfect. You'll see." "Goodbye," she called, and turned back home. Tomorrow her father would come for a visit, along with the 2 doctors who do a monthly checkup on her. It took great courage, but she resolved to tell him everything about the past week. Hiding the truth would do her no good, and she could only hope that her father would be as understanding as Jake. The helicopter landed, as it usually did, on a small pad just behind Susie's cabin. She sat on the grass next to it and waited for her father to emerge. On any other day, she would be looking forward to seeing him, but right then, she almost wished that he would leave. Susie loved her dad, and she knew he loved her too, but she never felt entirely comfortable around him. Maybe it was because he was so strict, and because he was always demanding more from her. She'd always tried to follow his rules and live as he wanted her to, which was never easy. Joseph Adams got out of the co-pilot's seat and stepped out onto the landing pad. He was followed by Dr. Sheridan and Dr. McCarthy, 2 men whom he trusted fully, and whom he knew he could depend on. They'd been monitoring Susie's abnormal growth for the past 10 years, trying to discover a way to stop it, without alerting the wider medical community of her existence. If news of her reached the outside world, it could have had severe consequences, which he wasn't ready to face. At the edge of the pad, Joseph saw his daughter waiting for him. He knew her better than anyone, but every time he saw her, her vast size still overwhelmed him. She could easily pick up the helicopter behind him as if it were a toy. Of course, she'd never actually done so. He taught her too well to behave so recklessly. He ran up to her, waving hand, and she lifted him into an embrace. It's great to see you, Susie, he said, as she gave him a little kiss on the face. You don't know how much I'd love to stay with you, to spend more time with you. I'm glad to see you too, Daddy, she said, for once not entirely truthfully. I'm missing you more and more every time you leave. It gets so lonely here. I know, sweetie. I know. I'm working as hard as I can to find a solution. It won't be long. I promise you. With technology improving every day, I'm positive we'll find a cure for you soon. But it's already taken so long, she said indignantly. I'm 15 years old, Daddy. My childhood will be over soon, and I've missed so much in life. I could spend my whole life like this, alone. You're the only one who loves me, and when you're gone, Joseph looked down at the two doctors, waiting uncomfortably on the ground below. He could feel his resolve slipping away. Every time he saw Susie, she became more and more sad, and it was breaking his heart. What she said was true, but there was nothing he could do to help her. He was a powerful man, but when it came to making his daughter happy, he was at a loss. I'm sorry, she said. I'm just a little upset, that's all. There's something I have to tell you, if that's okay. Of course, he said immediately. Take us inside and we'll talk. She greeted the doctors and let them step into her right hand. Unlike her father, they still found it unnerving to be carried by her, and it secretly amused her to watch them shifting around in the palm uncomfortably. She went inside and set them down on the bedside table before lying down on the bed. Outside, the helicopter took off. The pilot would always fly around the perimeter, making sure everything was still in order. So, baby, what is it that you're so upset about? Joseph asked, trying to sound relaxed. Nothing serious, I hope. Susie didn't answer for a while. When she did, her voice sounded heavy with emotion. Daddy, I'm really sorry. I've done something awful, and now I don't know what'll happen. I want to tell you, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid you'll be angry with me, that you won't love me anymore. No, Joseph cried. Susie, don't talk like that. I'm your father, for God's sake, not some monster to be afraid of. There's nothing you can do that'll stop me from loving you. You know that. Now tell me, what happened? What did you do? She told him everything that happened during the week, and he couldn't believe what he heard. If she had been a little younger, his first reaction would have been anger. But Susie was no longer an irresponsible child. She was on the verge of adulthood, and he would no longer be able to make decisions for her. He looked at her, her full length stretched out on the bed, and saw for the first time a young woman instead of a little girl. In a way, it was as if she no longer needed him. But what she did, at least as far as hurting the three boys, was concerning. There would be all sorts of repercussions. A potential nightmare lay ahead for him. It was only a matter of time before the whole world would know about her, and he was not looking forward to explaining his actions. As he wondered what to tell his crying daughter, the radio on his belt crackled. The helicopter pilot was trying to contact him, so he picked up the radio. What is it, Dick? He asked. We've got a problem, sir, the pilot's voice answered. I've just flown past the south perimeter and, well, there's a girl here, and she's calling your daughter's name. What? A girl? Joseph said in disbelief. Then he remembered that Susie told him something about a girl who was with the other boys. He wasn't the only one who was shocked, though. Susie had heard the little conversation and had sat upright in surprise. Linda, she said. Daddy, it's Linda, the girl I told you about. I have to go see her. You'll stay right here, her dad said, before she even completed her sentence. Susie, I'm not angry at you, But you've done enough harm already. I'll handle this situation. You stay here with the doctors while they do the checkup. Is that understood?" But she wasn't listening to him. She stood up and lifted him and the doctors off the table. "You've done so much for me, Daddy," she said, bringing them close to her face. "But I'm old enough now to make my own decisions. I'm the one who started all this, and I'm going to take care of it myself." Her father sat rather helplessly as she carried him and the doctors outside and set them on the ground. Joseph was used to being the one in charge, but now the situation had reversed. Susie stood up, dwarfing them like a colossus, and he felt insignificant beside her. He stood next to her shoe and noticed that he was barely taller than her ankle. "Susie," he called up to her. "Susie, please, listen to me. Don't do this. It's too dangerous." She gave him a little smile. "I'll be fine, Daddy. You've taught me to be careful. And besides, there isn't really anything that can hurt me. At least, not here. I'll make you proud. I promise." Joseph stood powerless as she strode off. He'd never seen her this confident and resolute before. But there was something comforting about the way she told him she'd handled the situation. Perhaps this little girl was finally discovering that she possessed enormous strength within her. Linda watched in awe as the giantess approached her. It just seemed so unreal. Clad in denim jeans and a plain black t-shirt, Susie looked just like any other girl, but she was freaking huge. No wonder she lived by herself in the forest. There was no house in town that she could even fit into, let alone live in. She stepped over the fence and slowly laid herself down on the ground, being careful not to crush Linda beneath her. The diminutive brunette stood back and wondered whether it had been a good idea to come here, but the giantess smiled at her, a warm and caring smile, and she felt a tiny bit safer. "Hi there," Susie said in the most gentle voice. "Hi," Linda managed to say. Her heart was thumping violently and she was sweating everywhere. How was she supposed to talk to this mountain of a girl? Susie held her open hand behind Linda and lightly tipped her over, letting her fall backwards into her hand. "It's okay," she said. "Don't be afraid of me. I know I wasn't very nice to you, and I'm truly sorry. You see, I've never been friends with other girls before, so I don't really know how I'm supposed to treat them. In fact," she added, "it'd be wonderful if we can be friends. You know, start over and all that." I don't know. Oh, come on. Don't tell me you'd rather stay with that jerk." "No," Linda cried. "No, it's over between me and Billy. I never want to see him again, ever." She calmed down a little, and Susie waited patiently for her to continue. I came to talk to you about Jake." "Yes? What is it?" Susie urged her on impatiently. Well, I think he's in trouble." Linda began to talk quickly now. "You see, Billy's in the hospital, and he's in pretty bad shape. And he knew no one would believe no one would believe him if he said what happened, so he blamed it all on Jake. And Frank and Arthur, they backed him up. They said Jake had attacked him and beaten him, and Billy's dad believed them. He's the chief of police, Billy's dad. I was there when he told his men to go and arrest Jake. I wanted to say something, but who'd believe me? Now they're going to put him in jail, I think. I don't know. I didn't know what to do, so I came looking for you." "Why?" Susie asked, not believing what she was hearing. "Because I thought you could do something. I mean, you're so big, and you clearly love him." "What?" Susie cried. "I'm not in love with him. I'm just his friend." "No, you're not," Linda said. She didn't know if this was safe to talk to Susie about. but she felt she had to. I saw how you looked at him when you said goodbye. The same way I used to look at Billy before I knew who he really was. You've shown me the truth, Susie. I've been really nasty to Jake, and you were right to be so mad at me. I was once like him, you know? A new kid at school, no friends. Everyone made fun of me back then, and I felt like I had to get back at them somehow. Billy never loved me. He just used me to show off to everyone. And I went along with him because I didn't feel like there was anything else I could do. She looked up at Susie's giant green eyes and saw only compassion in them. Then she was lifted and held against Susie's cheek and caressed by her fingers. Linda had never, ever imagined herself in such a situation. She felt both bewildered and afraid, but also safe and secure. Right then she knew she wanted to be friends with Susie. Who wouldn't want a giant friend, looking after you and protecting you from all the dangers of the world? I need your help, Linda, Susie said. If Jake's in trouble, I have to go and help him. If the police see me with their own eyes, they'll no longer think he's guilty. Will you help me, please? She held the tiny girl in front of her face, close enough to see fear in her eyes. There was no doubt that going after Jake would be dangerous. Susie wanted to leave Linda out of it, but she didn't know the way and needed someone to guide her. Linda hesitated a moment before nodding and agreeing to help. I'm really scared, she said. Promise you won't let anything happen to me? I promise, Susie said. Just show me which way to go and leave the rest to me. She stood up, holding Linda securely in her cupped hands. Then she set off down the path towards Barton as quickly as she could, hoping that they weren't too late.